There's a short list of things that I can say about Snatcher that's non-spoilery. It's a visual novel. It's got light gun stages. It costs $11 bajillion. In its story, Hideo Kojima proposes the question, what do you get when you mash up the plots of Blade Runner and Invasion of the Body Snatchers? Incidentally, Hideo Kojima watched a lot of cable TV. Unfortunately, his answer appears to throw away any deeper allegorical meanings contained within the source materials, and results in a conclusion that's both superficial and dumb. But if you like Blade Runner because neon, half-naked robot girls, because it's really cool when Rutger Hauer breaks Harrison Ford's fingers, by all means, this might be the game for you.
This is for Chris.
I don't mean that as an insult. Really. While I was playing through Snatcher, I was absolutely enthralled. The presentation is superb, especially for a frickin' visual novel. The animations and voice acting breathe life to the adventure, and there's very little downtime.
The Snatcher's functions have been terminated.
Mika, are you alright?
Yes. Yes, I think so. Thank you.
The charismatic, albeit somewhat sex-obsessed protagonist jumps from climax to punchline to intrigue with fluid regularity. There's a dirty joke in there somewhere. The puzzles err on the side of hand-holdy, but never interfere with the pacing of the action. Snatcher is a good time with a lot of pizzazz, which is to its credit, because if the player actually had the chance to stop and think about the plot, they might realize it's terrible.
My arm! I can't reach my blaster! I'm hit in the leg!
Is that the best you can do, Junker?
Like I said, Snatcher flagrantly draws inspiration from multiple sci-fi classics, even going so far as to trace over movie production stills for in-game illustrations. There's homage, and then there's plagiarism. An homage is when Gizmo watches Invasion of the Body Snatchers in bed as Billy feeds Spike and the gang the after-midnight snack that will soon transform them into pupil pods. And then there's what Snatcher does, which is stitch together a story entirely from the cloth cut from other people's work. The various sources that ultimately contributed to the development of Snatcher were often subtle, but nearly everyone immediately recognizes the parallels to Blade Runner. In both media, a hard-nosed detective makes a living snuffing out androids posing as real people in a gritty Neo-Tokyo future. Snatcher may as well have been called Blade Runner the Game, except it wasn't. Instead, it was named for Body Snatchers, a sci-fi serial story turned multiple film adaptations about a small town whose population is covertly replaced with alien body doubles. Kojima's robotic snatchers are a fitting substitution for the original pod people. The two plots fit together seamlessly, provided you throw out Blade Runner's subtext about racism, which Kojima has. In Blade Runner, the replicants are man-made slaves who mirror humanity in every way. They have emotion, they dream, they fear death. The protagonist Deckard comes to identify with the replicants and in the end realizes that they are one and the same. Snatchers, like the pod people, are inhuman, emotionless monsters that infiltrate humanity with an aim for world domination. Unlike Deckard, Gillian Seed has no sympathetic revelation about their nature.
A phased particle beam, huh? That'll wipe this complex right off the map!
Everything, including the soil, will simply evaporate. The attack will leave just a large crater.
Instead, they are a dire threat to the survival of all humanity and must be eradicated. Underneath the Body Snatchers' fanciful tale of alien invasion lurks a dark warning against the loss of individuality and the dangers of conformity. The first film adaptation, titled Invasion of the Body Snatchers, was released in 1956, during a politically strained point of American history when the right feared the spread of communist ideology within the nation, and the left were routinely blacklisted from their jobs for the mere suspicion of being members of the Communist Party. Both sides of the political spectrum recognized the film as a parable for their fear, the complete alienation from once beloved neighbors and family in the wake of an insidious spread of paranoia and distrust. Kojima, on the other hand, tossed all of that out the window and latched onto the concept of communists as the ultimate baddies, because nothing says video game badassery quite like communist robots, who, in keeping with the cinematic references, happen to look exactly like T-800s. And we couldn't have a game about Cold War-era communism without a military arms race gone horribly wrong. Kojima's third inspiration for Snatcher wasn't a film, but a then-recent event. In April of 1986, a series of explosions within the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the Soviet Union caused reactor meltdown that quickly killed 30 and infected somewhere between a few 100,000 to nearly 1 million victims more with radiation poisoning. So many that the exact total of people ultimately killed by the disaster are incalculable. At the time, the entire world was briefly united in a collective fear from the effects of nuclear fallout, and the seed for Snatcher's catastrophe was planted. In the world of Snatcher, Soviet Russia was developing a biological weapon known as Lucifer Alpha in the fictional city of Chernobyl, so named obviously for the real-life disaster. Somewhere the agent is leaked into the atmosphere in an event that became known ominously as the catastrophe. Eventually, half the world's population dies from exposure before the virus can be eradicated. Jump ahead 50 years, and the aftermath of the catastrophe is impossible to ignore. There is no one alive whose life and family weren't radically altered by the event. At first, the importance of the catastrophe in relationship to current events is unclear. But while the real-life Chernobyl was a disaster born from negligence and Soviet hubris, Chernobyl's catastrophe was devastation by design. The rise of the Snatchers is the next stage of a revenge scheme 50 years in the making. Now, this is the point of the review where I have to talk about the game's ending. There's just no way to critique the story without spoiling the events of the finale. If that's something you don't want to see, then I suggest you click away. Maybe even check out my review on Laplace's Demon, which, similarly, examines plagiarism in video games, and cue intermission. Okay, for those of you still with me, let's continue. Up until the third act climax, I was completely enthralled by the adventure and couldn't wait to see where Kojima was headed with this fascinating mashup of plots.
I'm so sorry!
Snatcher!
Of course, this was before I realized that without someone else's story to fall back on, he just wasn't a very good writer. If that statement sounds overly harsh, it's because my disappointment in the game's conclusion was directly proportional to my previous enthusiasm. As it turns out, Gillian Seed and his estranged wife Jamie were once members of the Soviet development team that created the Snatchers. The plan was to replace all the world's leaders with Soviet-controlled clones. This would render Gillian, at the very least, a butthole villain. Except, conveniently, he was actually an American CIA double agent, thus relieving the player of the burden of questioning his moral character. But he still hits on his dead partner's teenage daughter, so gross. Gillian's wife, on the other hand, was evidently a willing participant in the project. Anyway, she's hot, so don't worry about it. So hot, in fact, that her research partner, Elijah Modner, had fallen in love with her. But when Gillian Chad entered the scene and stole his woman, Modner lost his cool, released Lucifer Alpha into the atmosphere, and, murdered a few billion people. Somewhere during a 30-minute cutscene, Snatcher had transformed from noir sci-fi thriller into the anthem of the involuntarily celibate. In reality, Jamie never loved Modner. He was such an unlikable dweeb that his own father constructed a cooler, sexier clone to replace him. He might have been a sympathetic villain were it not for the fact that he was an egotistical, manipulative creep prone to throwing genocidal tantrums when shit didn't go his way. But as much as he hated himself, women, and pretty much everyone else, he spared the lives of Gillian and Jamie, who had entered a cryogenic chamber during the outbreak, threw himself one hell of a pity party, and began work on his magnum opus, the total annihilation of mankind. My problem with this reveal is it's so superficial. There's no deeper meaning behind the Snatcher menace. It all boils down to the insane whims of a narcissistic megalomaniac who couldn't handle the rejection of a woman. Which is fine. I don't need all my video games to be on par with cinematic masterpieces. Except Kojima had stolen so much from actual cinematic masterpieces. He took all the cool flashy bits, made a pretty Frankenstein creation, and left all the substance on the operating table. It's no crime to love Snatcher. It's a fantastic love letter to sci-fi cinema. But we do ourselves no favors by lauding Kojima for his creative vision. The story he weaves is ultimately as soulless as the Snatcher's robotic shells, and frankly, I question whether he ever truly understood the films he was aping.
electronic